Culture clash and Clampett heart, loyalty, laughter, and lasting charm. I can still feel the quiet sense of completion that settles over me whenever I reach the end of this particular stretch of the Beverly Hillbillies. The castle has been left behind. The greenwood in Griffith Park has been returned to the hikers and the rangers. The tank has been surrendered and the blasting powder accounted for. What remains is the family itself, steady, affectionate, and ready for whatever comes next. Even as a child, I understood that the real story was never the successive costumes or the temporary stages. The real story was the way the Clampetts moved through every collision with the wider world without ever losing the center that made them who they were. Looking back across the entire arc, from the first moment the family stood in that English courtyard, to the final quiet negotiations over bail and returned equipment, I am struck by how consistently the series trusted its characters to remain themselves. Jethro put on the armor of a knight, the Lincoln green of an outlaw, and the historical uniforms of half a dozen generals. Yet the young man inside the costumes never changed. He was always the same eager, wholehearted participant in whatever story he had decided to inhabit. Max Baer Jr. gave that consistency a physical and emotional truth that still feels remarkable. The fantasies grew larger and more elaborate, but the affection with which the audience was invited to watch them never wavered. Ellie Mae's parallel journey carries its own quiet grace. She climbed the castle tower and bellowed for knights who never arrived. She put on the damsel dress again in the front yard of the Beverly Hills mansion and then in the trees of Griffith Park. She followed her cousin into every chapter of the legend without ever fully surrendering her own clearer sight. Donna Douglas made the loyalty both comic and genuinely moving. Ellie Mae did not share every delusion, but she shared the love that made the delusions possible, and that sharing remains one of the deepest expressions of family the series ever offered. Granny's presence throughout the arc is the necessary counterweight of practical mountain reality. She tried to doctor a man who had already been dead a month. She threatened to whitewash 6 centuries of English stone. She prepared smoked crawdads that briefly became a sacrament to the flower children. She kept her eye on the fall festival, even while the park was being torn by tank treads. Irene Ryan played every shift with the same fierce practical energy. The world could change costumes as often as it liked. Granny would continue to meet it with the tools and the standards she had brought from the hills. Jed's steady presence is the moral ground on which everything else stands. He paid the $10 million in death duties without drama. He accepted the role of tyrant in Jethro's outlaw letter without resentment. He wrote the checks for bail and damages without lecture. Buddy Ebsen made that steadiness feel like the most natural thing in the world, in a decade that was loudly questioning every form of authority. Jed's quiet authority, rooted entirely in care rather than control, felt like a form of wisdom the wider culture was in danger of forgetting. Mr. Drysdale and Miss Hathaway provide the necessary external measure of how thoroughly the Clampett imagination can disrupt ordinary systems. Raymond Bailey's banker was forced to negotiate with knights, outlaws, and tank commanders, often while wearing the borrowed costumes of the current fantasy. Nancy Culp's secretary was ordered into a field marshal's uniform and into the belly of a tank. Their repeated survival of these absorptions, and their repeated return to the attempt to manage the unmanageable, remains one of the great comic partnerships of the series. The cultural collisions that run through the entire arc still feel alive to me. An American family with oil money and mountain manners inherits a piece of English history and treats it as another farm to be managed. A young man converts a public park into Sherwood Forest and then into a private military proving ground. Flower children mistake smoked crawdads for a different kind of smoke and briefly elect a Clampett as their far-out leader. Institutions try and fail to fit the events into recognizable categories. In every case, the series refuses to declare a simple winner. The Clampetts do not conquer the systems they encounter. They simply continue to be themselves until the systems have to make room, or the family decides the cost has become too high. I think often of how these episodes shaped my own early understanding of what it means to remain loyal to people who refuse to be sensible. The Clampetts never required Jethro to abandon his successive identities in order to remain loved. They required only that the family stay intact, while the identities ran their course. That distinction between controlling the imagination and accompanying it still feels like one of the gentlest and most radical lessons the series ever offered. The laughter that runs through the entire arc is never cruel. We laugh at the armor that fails to prevent a ringing skull. We laugh at the outlaw who cannot find a single fat merchant. We laugh at the tank loaded with rocks and blasting powder. Yet the laughter is always mixed with affection for the absolute commitment that produces the failures. Jethro is never smaller than his fantasies, he is exactly as large as they are, and the family and the audience are invited to live at that scale with him for as long as the story requires. The lasting charm of these episodes for me lies in their refusal to resolve the tension between the Clampett heart and the wider world. The family returns from England with the castle chapter closed but the imagination still wide open. They extract themselves from Griffith Park with the outlaw chapter closed but the capacity for the next chapter undiminished. The tank is returned, the bail is paid, and the road toward the hills and the festival remains open. Nothing has been permanently settled. Everything has been temporarily survived with the essential bonds still intact. I have carried these stories with me across every decade of my life. They have served as comfort, as laughter, and as a quiet reminder that the most valuable inheritance is not a castle or a fortune or a legend. It is the ability to meet every new stage, whether stone courtyard or public park, or the interior of a tank, with the same practical loyalty and the same refusal to become anyone but oneself. The Clampetts never learned to perform the roles the world expected. Instead, they taught the world again and again how to make room for the roles they had already chosen. In the end, the culture clashes fade. The costumes are put away. The temporary stages are returned to their ordinary uses. What remains is the sound of a family that has once again come through the storm together, already half ready for whatever improbable chapter will arrive next. That sound, loyalty mixed with laughter, practicality mixed with an almost bottomless willingness to try, still feels like home. It is the reason I continue to return to these episodes, and the reason they continue to feel as alive and as necessary as they did when I first watched them in the soft light of a childhood living room. The Clampett heart does not conquer the world. It simply continues to beat according to its own rhythm, and in that continuation the series finds a comedy that is both raucous and deeply kind. I remain grateful for every minute of the journey, from the first footstep in the English courtyard to the last quiet negotiation over returned equipment and posted bail. The story's end. The affection does not. That, more than any castle or forest or tank, is the lasting inheritance these episodes leave behind.